want one of those. So I want to talk to you a little bit today about adaptation. And adaptation is the basic idea that we get used to stuff. Stuff happens, and we get used to it in many levels. And usually when people think about adaptation, the standard story is the story of the frog in boiling water. You all know the story. The idea is that you put a frog in hot water, and the frog is uncomfortable and jumps out. You put it in lukewarm water, and it stays happily. And then if you raise the temperature just a little bit at a time, the frog gets used to that level of increased temperature until eventually the story goes, the frog dies in the hot water. Turns out this story is wrong. This doesn't happen. But I'm willing to bet that if this was a committee of frogs, they would stay there. But the principle turns out to be a general principle. And the basic idea is as follows. When good things happen to us, we're happy. When bad things happen to us, we aren't happy. And when good things happen, we think to ourselves that we'll be happy for a long time. Turns out that's not the case. When good things happen to us, we're happy for a while, but then we get less happy over time. And that's adaptation. The second part of it works in a reverse way. When bad things happen to us, we think we'll be miserable for a long time. It turns out we are miserable, but for a shorter duration than we think. Basically, things shift back to our general starting point. So that's the general principle. And today I want to tell you two very different stories about adaptation. And they kind of take very different paths to adaptation and kind of talk about the range of adaptation we can have. And the first one of those is adaptation to pain. So one of the first classes I took as an undergrad was a class on the physiology of the brain from a guy called Hanan Frank in Tel Aviv. And this class was very interesting in terms of the content of the class. But what also was interesting for me that Hanan was a double amputee. He lost both of his legs many years earlier, and he made pain his passion. So he started becoming a researcher of pain, did lots of interesting work on pain. And because we were in the same hospital many years apart and knew some of the same doctors, physicians, and so on, and we both shared lots of experience with pain, often I would come to him after class and we would talk about pain academically and personal. And in one of those discussions, I came to him and I said, you know, Hanan, I just went to the dentist 2 days ago, and I realized I asked him not to give me any pain medications, no Novocaine, and it drilled, and it was painful, but I didn't care so much about it. It's kind of a strange experience. I'm not sure, am I starting to enjoy pain? What's going on here? And he said that he did the same thing, that for the last 20 years, he's gone to the dentist without taking any pain medication. So now we're a little worried, right? What's happening to us? So we decided to test it empirically. We went to an Army veteran country club. This was a country club that was only for people who got injured in different ways during the service. And we set up a tub with very hot water, and we asked people to put their arm in. And we say, put your arm in and keep it until the heat becomes pain. This was called the pain threshold, right? If you put your hand in hot water, you would realize after a few seconds it's hot, and then it starts being hurt. We said, tell us when it becomes painful, and then keep it there. And keep it there for as long as you can. That's what people did, and then we did the same thing with the other arm. And the question was, when would people tell us it starts hurting, the interpretation of pain, and how long could people sustain that amount of pain? And we did this for many people. And when we finished, we took the medical files of all the people who participated in the experiment. We went back to the hospital where Hanan and I used to be, and we gave it to a group of physicians and occupational therapists and nurses. And we said, please take this pile and sort it into two types, people who were severely injured and people who were not so severely injured. So here we had two groups of people who had very similar life experience. The only difference was many years earlier when they got injured, they had different severity of injury. But remember, this was many years afterwards. So the question is, what does a severe injury does throughout life? And basically, This is what happens when you give an Israeli a mouse. Let's see. And. So did I keep on pressing it all along on the wrong thing? OK, so we had the people who were severely injured, and we had the people who were slightly injured. And what happened? The people who were severely injured tolerated much more of the pain than the people who were lightly injured. So first of all, Hanan and I felt we were not odd or strange. This was kind of a more general thing. I should say that we asked people never to keep their hand in the hot water for more than 60 seconds. We didn't want anybody to get burned. And on the severely injured group, almost everybody, we had to tell them to take their hands out. Right? So there was a really substantial difference. So what this suggests is that somehow an experience with an injury immunizes people from pain. It kind of gives us a different way of looking at pain. Now, a really interesting part of the study came from another group of people. We put ads in this veteran country club, and many people came. And two of the people who came were not the kind of injuries we were looking for. One person had an immune disease, another person had an intestinal problem. These were people with chronic injuries. But they came to the lab, they said, could we be tested? I didn't know what to do. Should I inflict more pain on them? Should I tell them that they're unwelcome? I don't know which one of those is worse, but data is data, so I decided to accept them. So we had another group of people who had this chronic injury. There were only two of them, and we shouldn't make too much of a big deal out of this, but here's the question. What will happen to those people with chronic injuries? They had lots of experience with pain. Would they be like this severely injured group? Turns out their pain tolerance and threshold were even lower than the people who were lightly injured. And my interpretation of this is that people like Hanan and myself, for us, pain has been associated with getting better. If you think about when do we get pain, it's physical therapy, it's operation, it's treatments. All of those things are very painful, but they're connected to getting better. And because of that, over time, we could associate pain with something positive. Right? For the people who have chronic injury, pain has a very different interpretation. It means things are not going well. Right? Things are actually deteriorating. And because of that, they actually were much more sensitive to pain. So when we think about pain, I think there are kind of two aspects. There's a question of what's the signal we're getting? And I don't think I'm getting less of a signal of pain than other people if you prick me or I get an injection or anything like that. But what does change is the interpretation of this signal. How bad is it? How much fear do I have? What does it mean? And this interpretation changes because of past experience. So that's the first aspect of adaptation. Adaptation has to do with how we learn to interpret signals and think about them differently. In a very different way, I want to talk about the second story about adaptation, which is social adaptation. Adaptation to what our position is in life. So there is something that we call assortative matching or assortative mating. And the idea is that there's a social hierarchy. You could sort all men from undesirable to more desirable, and you could sort all women from undesirable to more desirable. And if you do that, you would find out that people basically kind of mate with people on their own level of desirability. Beautiful people marry beautiful people, not so beautiful, not so beautiful, unbeautiful, unbeautiful. This is kind of how things sort out. Now, if you're very rich, or if you're or if you're a British rock star, things can compensate a little bit. But in general, we find this pattern of assortative mating. And like everybody else, before I got injured, I kind of knew where my society, my space was in society. I mean, we all have a feeling, right? We all know who would date us and who would not, who is in our league and who is not, where we stack up into this. But then, when I got injured, for a while I didn't think about anything romantic. When you have too much pain, that's not high on the priority list. But when I was getting a little bit better, I started thinking about romance. And I was thinking, where would I fit in this hierarchy? Like before my injury, I knew who would date me, who would not date me. What will happen now? Right? Let's say before the injury I was 7, if we give it some scale, and now I was a 4. What will happen? Will the women who would date me before stop dating me? After all, they had other options. Why would they go for me? It's a competitive, two-sided market. And I thought to myself, does it mean that I would have to settle? Right? If we think about assortative mating and I'm now a 4, would I have to marry somebody who is a 4? Right? And how would that feel? Would I wake up for the rest of my life looking at the bed next to me and say, I really wanted a 7. I thought I deserve a 7, but I could get it a 4. And, I didn't feel I really changed, right? Of course, I changed in many ways externally, but I didn't feel I kind of changed fundamentally about who I was. That I didn't like this idea that I will have to settle because somehow my market value in the singles market have decreased. I mean, I realized that I was less valuable, but I really didn't like this idea that I was less valuable. So that was one thing. The second thing that happened was that as I was getting better, as the scars were getting healed and the transplants were catching, life actually got worse as a burn patient. That was kind of surprising because, I thought that the moment my burns would get covered with new skin, everything would be fine. It turns out there's a new level of complexity, which is that scars really shrink. So if I would sit, for example, like this for 2 hours, I wouldn't be able to stretch my arms anymore because the skin would just shrink, and I would have to start slowly stretching my skin. And it still happens. This skin is very non-flexible. So for example, if I pull my arm, you can see my neck is moving because it's just kind of one piece of skin. It doesn't have the regular flexibility, and it keeps on shrinking, and I have to stretch it all the time. And that was awful because I felt, not only did my body get burned, and I was still the same inside, but nobody could see me, but now these scars were kind of fighting actively against me, right? I mean, I imagine you had to work against your body every day, kind of hurting yourself and trying to maintain the sense of motion, and your body was kind of resisting you in this way, and so quickly. So this was terrible. I felt kind of really alienation from my body, and then I came to a resolution. I didn't want to settle. I didn't feel this was right. I really kind of had a hard time with my body. So my resolution was to be a monk, No need to get involved in these questions, right? I will just live an intellectual life and ignore any kind of physical aspect of life. And it kind of helped me because all of a sudden I kind of got extra vigorous about pushing my body to its limits and stressing the skin more and kind of enduring more pain in the process. But then what happened is that I had an operation, and like many other operations, every time I had an operation, they could not put me in the bath to remove the bandages. So they would bathe me in bed. They would take the bandages off and so on. And this was a while after I was injured. I had an operation. They were bathing me in bed. And a very nice nurse was washing my stomach and upper thighs. And something happened that hadn't happened in a long time. So I got an erection which, embarrassed me and amused her. She said it was a great sign of starting to recover. And that also made me realize that the monk idea was not such a... not going to work out. But it made me think about, so how is this adaptation going to work? How am I going to find my space in society? How am I going to make peace with it? How am I going to be happy with what I had? And I came up with 3 theories. The first theory is that maybe I will never adapt. Maybe for the rest of my life, I would look at the person next to me and say, oh, wish I could. The second possibility is that if something like this happened, we can change how we view what we like. So imagine, for example, a woman could say, I really not that attractive, So what she's going to do is she's going to start liking bald men. I mean, nothing against bald men, but imagine that people are not high in the attractiveness scale. You can say, you know what? I'm going to change my preference and then start liking something that is less popular by other people. It could mean that we would change our taste to basically be happy with something else. Right? This is like the sour grape theory. I can't reach here, I'll start liking people in my range. Oh, my goodness. And finally, you could imagine that you reorder the importance of attributes. So you say, I can't be with very attractive people. Let me look for nice people, or kind, or look for some other attributes. So we decided to look at this, and the first way I looked at it was going to a website called Hot or Not. And the way Hot or Not works is that you see a picture of somebody, and you get to rate them on a scale from not to hot. And after you rate them, you get the average rating from other people of this person, and you get a picture of another person. In this case, a more attractive. Okay. So now the question is, what will happen? Would people who are very attractive view differently attractiveness than people who are not attractive, kind of sour grape theory? People who are low on their attractiveness start evaluating things differently? Could it be the case that people just somehow over-optimistically shoot? Everybody will be kind of just a little bit over-optimistic. Or could it be that everybody will value attractiveness in the same way? And it turns out that that's the result. Everybody values attractiveness in the same way. So if we go back to our plot, it seems people don't change their perception of aesthetics. It's not as if people who are low on the scale start enjoying bald, hairy, some back tooth kind of activity as a preference. Could it be that people don't adapt? On the Hot or Not website, there's also something called Meet Me, when you can see pictures of people. You can say, do you want to meet them or not? This is not about the evaluation of aesthetics. It's about whether you want to actually try and meet them. Could it be that people are basically clueless? Well, it turns out that would it be the case that everybody would want to date the same people, kind of not understanding our place in society? No. It turns out that people basically understand their place in society. So we all appreciate beauty in the same way, but then when it comes to meet people, people basically try to meet people in their own level of attractiveness. Okay, so this is the dilemma, right? We all like the same attractiveness, but we settle in some way. By the way, people are a little bit over-optimistic in that regard. And men are slightly more optimistic than women, aim slightly higher than women. So the thing that was remaining was that people perhaps reordered the importance of attribute. And the way to test it is we created a speed dating event. Imagine the circles are men and the diamonds are women, and people talk to each other for 5 minutes, and then they basically switch to the next person and talk to another. And then at the end of the event, they tell us who they want to meet. But we also got them to rate each person on how attractive and funny and sensible and kind and so on. And what we basically found is that attractive people want to look for other attractive people. Less attractive people look for kind people. Sense of humor. What turns out to be the mechanism is that people who have attractiveness go for attractiveness. People who are not, and they can't get that, basically make sense of the world and adapt by reordering the importance of attributes, by finding out and saying, you know, something else is important to me. In this case, sense of humor and kindness of other things, which is a very sensible survivor mechanism. The last thing I want to say is that while adaptation is an incredibly useful mechanism, it doesn't always work. And I'll give you one example. So in my case, one of the things that has never worked for me is getting used to how I think other people look at me. Never get used to it. And I think it's because, and the question is why. I think it's because I meet lots of new people all the time. And I get reminders of the fact that I look somewhat different. And also when people shake my hand, it's always a reminder, right? People are anxious, you know, how do they shake my hand? Do they, don't they? And that's a continuous reminder of the fact that I'm not that I'm injured and I have some residue. Now, I know this will all make you uncomfortable for the next few days if you consider this. But I think the lesson here is that there are lots of cases when we adapt, but there's also cases when adaptation fails. And I think those cases are when we get intermittent reminders about the fact how things could have been, and this kind of keeps us from adapting. So, adaptation is generally great. We adapt to lots of bad things. I'm a living proof to that. Sadly, we also adapt to some good things that happen. We wish we didn't. And it's interesting to figure out in our lives what are the kind of things that we adapt to and what are the kind of things that we don't adapt to. And maybe take this into consideration when we decide what kind of experiences to pursue and not to pursue. And that's it for me, and thank you very much.